The Asylum plot. She tried to lock me away, so I bulldozed her perfect life disclaimer. This is a fictional story, but the lessons about family, betrayal, and the consequences of unbridled greed are very real. I am Rick Dawson. Every action I take is calculated, measured, and weighed against its inevitable physical and psychological consequences. So, when I quietly logged into my secure online banking portal that Tuesday morning, changed my direct deposit details, and transferred my entire monthly engineering pension to a private, heavily encrypted card, I did not do it out of sudden spite. It was time to tear the house down to the bare dirt. Exactly 2 hours after I executed the massive transfer, the front door of my modest, detached guest house was violently kicked open. The heavy oak door, which I had painstakingly sanded and varnished myself just 2 summers ago, splintered inward with a sickening, violent crack. The brass doorknob hit the drywall behind it, punching a fist-sized hole straight through the plaster. I did not flinch. The dark liquid barely rippled. My son-in-law, Mitchell, stormed into the room first. His carefully styled hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, unhinged energy. My daughter, Sarah, followed closely behind him. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire privileged existence flash before her eyes. Mitchell did not bother with a standard greeting. He leaned in so close that I could smell the bitter tang of his expensive espresso mixed with the sour, metallic stench of his blind, entitled rage. "Give me the new pin." His spit flew across the table, landing near my coffee mug. He shrieked that he had just been profoundly humiliated in the glass-walled finance office of a high-end European auto dealership downtown. He had confidently strutted over to the dealership's lobby ATM to pull a massive cash advance, using my debit card, a card he treated as his own personal, limitless slush fund. But when he inserted the plastic, the machine instantly confiscated it. The screen had flashed a terrifying bright red message, indicating the account was permanently closed due to suspected fraud. Mitchell had been forced to awkwardly laugh it off, claiming his wealth manager must have locked the account by mistake before fleeing the dealership in absolute disgrace. Mitchell demanded to know what banking glitch had occurred. He demanded that I hand over the new banking card and the updated personal identification number right this second, so he could drive back downtown, salvage his shattered ego, and secure his ridiculous vehicle before someone else bought it. Sarah stood right behind him, nodding vigorously like an obedient puppet, her face twisted in a mask of supreme irritation. "Dad, hurry up!" she whined, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance, as if I were a slow child deliberately ruining her day. "The dealership is going to sell the SUV to someone else if we don't fix this right now. You're completely ruining our afternoon with this stupid bank error." I did not raise my voice. I let the absolute silence hang heavy in the air until the sheer oppressive weight of it made Sarah shift uncomfortably on her expensive designer heels. 3 years ago, the dynamic between us had looked very different. She pleaded with me to move into the small, detached guest house on her sprawling modern property. "I promise I'll take care of you, Dad," she had sobbed into my shoulder, her tears soaking through my shirt. "You shouldn't be alone in that big empty house. You just rest." She had asked for my primary debit card a week later. I handed her the small piece of plastic tied directly to my $500 monthly pension without a second thought. It was the worst miscalculation of my entire life. It was a structural failure that I had completely missed during the initial inspection. I looked at Sarah now. I looked at the daughter I had sacrificed so much to raise, and I asked her a very simple, quiet question. "Sarah," I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of any paternal warmth, "what exactly did you buy me for dinner this week?" She blinked, completely thrown off guard by the sudden pivot. She stammered, looking nervously at her husband for help, twisting the straps of her designer bag. Just give Mitchell the card." I stood up from my wooden chair. I grabbed the metal handle and swung the door wide open, revealing the empty wooden shelves inside. Inside the dark pantry sat exactly 3 severely dented cans of generic, off-brand chicken noodle soup, a half-empty box of stale saltine crackers, and a single heavily bruised apple resting on a crumpled paper towel. That was the absolute totality of the nutritional care my loving daughter had provided for me. I turned back to them and stated the cold, undeniable facts. I told them that my structural engineering pension A pension earned through 40 years of breathing in concrete dust, climbing steel girders, and working brutal 80-hour weeks had deposited over $60,000 into that joint account over the past 12 months alone. I pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the dented soup cans sitting on the bare wooden shelf. I asked them, with absolute icy precision, if that was what $60,000 bought in today's modern economy. Mitchell rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh of supreme annoyance. He threw his hands up in the air, his face twisting into an ugly sneer of pure contempt. "Oh my God, you're being so incredibly dramatic," he scoffed, his tone dripping with condescension. "You don't need much money anyway. You just sit around this guest house all day, doing absolutely nothing. Now, stop wasting our time talking about cheap soup and give me the damn card." Their property. He really believed it was his property. The sheer, blinding arrogance of the statement almost made me laugh. I slowly walked over to the small oak bookshelf tucked into the corner of my living room. I walked back to the kitchen table and dropped it directly in front of Mitchell. Thud. The heavy sound echoed loudly in the small room, rattling the ceramic coffee mug on the table. Inside were hundreds of pages of highlighted bank statements, meticulous forensic accounting notes, and printed, time-stamped photographs showing their exact movements and purchases. I looked Mitchell straight in his arrogant eyes and told him the absolute truth. I had sat down in the glass office of the branch manager, presented my federal identification, closed the joint account permanently, and transferred every single cent of my future pension payouts to a private, heavily guarded institution that neither of them would ever have the legal authority to access. Mitchell sneered, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, attempting to maintain his superior posture. He claimed, with a completely straight face, that he only used the extra pension money for essential property upkeep, rising property taxes, and emergency maintenance that benefited all of us. I turned to the very first tab in the heavy binder. I simply began to read his exact, itemized expenditures out loud, my voice echoing in the small room like a federal judge delivering a final, inescapable sentence. I read the exact date and time of a $4,000 charge for a VIP beachfront cabana at an exclusive resort in Miami, Florida. The date perfectly matched the exact same weekend I was recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia, lying completely alone, shivering in this unheated guest house while they sipped expensive cocktails 1,000 miles away. I read off the weekly $300 charges at a high-end exclusive steakhouse downtown. These dates matched perfectly with the exact same nights Sarah had called me from her car, fake sighing heavily into the phone, claiming they were just too busy working late at the office to bring me a hot meal, telling me to just microwave a frozen dinner because she was simply too exhausted to cook. I flipped the heavy page, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and read the itemized jewelry receipt for Sarah's new, glittering diamond tennis bracelet. It was purchased for $6,500 using funds that were explicitly earmarked, labeled, and automatically deposited specifically for my supplemental health insurance premiums. I read line after line, dollar after dollar. It proved exactly how they had systematically, ruthlessly drained my life savings to fund an arrogant, lavish, upper-class lifestyle, all while treating me like a stray, unwanted dog living in their backyard. "The gravy train has officially derailed," I told them, my voice completely flat, completely devoid of any paternal warmth or forgiveness. "You will never see another single dime of my money. If you are not out of this room in 10 seconds, I am calling the police to report the past 3 years of heavily documented elder financial abuse." I expected them to cower. I expected Mitchell to panic about his ruined credit score, his corporate reputation, and the very real threat of criminal fraud charges. I was entirely wrong. I had underestimated the sheer depth of their sociopathic entitlement. Mitchell did not apologize. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, his arrogance entirely restored. "You aren't calling the police, old man," Mitchell whispered, his voice dripping with toxic venom. "And you certainly aren't keeping your money." He tapped the manila folder with his manicured index finger and explained exactly what was inside. It was a fully drafted, legally formatted petition for full, involuntary conservatorship. He told me with a sickeningly proud, triumphant smile that over the past 6 months, He and Sarah had been meticulously documenting my supposed mental decline. He claimed I was becoming paranoid, forgetful, prone to violent outbursts, and dangerously unstable. This doctor, a man I had never met, spoken to, or even seen in passing, had signed a sworn, heavily notarized medical affidavit declaring that I was suffering from advanced, rapid-onset dementia and was entirely incapable of managing my own finances, my health care, or making basic life decisions. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice dripping with a fake, sickening sympathy that made my stomach physically turn. "It's for your own good, Daddy," she cooed, tilting her head and looking at me as if I were a confused toddler. "Your mind is clearly failing you. You're making up crazy, delusional stories about us stealing your money. We just want you to be safe." Mitchell checked his expensive gold watch again, acting as if he had a pressing golf tee time he couldn't afford to miss. He looked back at me and delivered his absolute, final ultimatum. He gave me exactly 24 hours to voluntarily hand over the new bank card, provide the updated PIN, and sign a comprehensive general power of attorney document, giving him immediate, unquestioned control of all my remaining assets. If I did exactly as I was told, like a good, obedient dog, they would generously allow me to keep living in the guest house. "If you refuse," Mitchell threatened, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying malice, "I will file this petition at the county courthouse first thing tomorrow morning. Once the judge rules in my favor, and he absolutely will, your assets will be completely seized. You will spend the rest of your days heavily medicated, staring at a blank wall, and completely forgotten by the world." Mitchell grabbed Sarah roughly by the arm, turned around, and walked out the door. They left the splintered, ruined door hanging wide open, allowing the cold afternoon wind to blow directly into my kitchen. They thought they had one. They thought I would spend the night trembling in fear, weeping into my calloused hands, and waiting to surrender my dignity in the morning to save myself from the horrors of a locked psychiatric ward. They had absolutely no idea that my silence was not fear. My silence was the sound of a master structural engineer realizing exactly where the critical weak points in their foundation were located. It was the quiet, calculating moment before a man prepares to bring an entire house crashing down to the ground. I stood in the center of my small kitchen, listening to the sound of Mitchell's expensive car engine fading down the long driveway. Most men would have reached for a telephone to call a friend, or perhaps even cried over the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of their own flesh and blood. I did not do any of those things. I spent 40 years calculating load-bearing walls, identifying microscopic stress fractures in concrete, and predicting the exact moment a massive foundation will buckle under pressure. I knew immediately that Mitchell was not acting out of mere anger over a canceled car reservation. The true prize was something much, much larger. If they were willing to commit egregious perjury by hiring a corrupt doctor to declare me legally incompetent, they were not doing it just to secure my monthly retirement checks. They wanted the main house, the surrounding property, my hidden investments, and the absolute authority to liquidate my entire existence. I had spent my life building an indestructible fortress for my daughter, and now her husband was trying to lock me in the dungeon. I walked into my bedroom, put on my heavy, weather-beaten wool coat, and grabbed my car keys. I had less than 23 hours left before they launched a legal strike that could permanently strip me of my human rights. I backed my vintage car out of the driveway and headed straight toward the towering glass buildings of the downtown financial district. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, perfectly mirroring the cold, calculated, predatory focus settling over my mind. I was no longer a grieving, compliant widower trying to keep the peace. I was a man preparing for absolute war. I pulled into the dimly lit subterranean parking garage of the tallest, most imposing glass building in the city. The heavy brass letters mounted on the double-frosted glass doors read, "Evans and Associates." Bradley Evans was not a friendly neighborhood attorney who handled minor traffic tickets or simple divorces. I had hired Bradley a decade ago to structure my original trust, and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he possessed the exact lack of human mercy I currently required. The young receptionist at the front desk opened her mouth to ask if I had a scheduled appointment, but I walked straight past her massive mahogany desk without breaking my stride. I pushed open the heavy solid oak door to Bradley's private corner office. He looked up from his massive dual computer screens, his sharp, calculating eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He saw the cold, murderous expression on my face, immediately closed his laptop with a sharp snap, and gestured toward the plush leather chair across from his desk. I did not offer a polite greeting. I sat down, placed both of my calloused hands flat on his polished desk, and got straight to the point. My son-in-law just threatened me with an involuntary conservatorship petition, I said, my voice steady, betraying zero emotion. He possesses a forged medical affidavit, declaring me mentally incompetent, and he has given me 24 hours to sign over power of attorney. Bradley did not gasp. He simply reached for a fresh yellow legal pad and an expensive silver fountain pen. "Give me the exact timeline, Rick," he demanded, his voice strictly business. I told him Mitchell had given me a 24-hour ultimatum to sign over my power of attorney, or he would file the petition with the county courthouse tomorrow morning. He leaned back in his tall leather chair, tapping the silver pen against his chin, his mind already working through the massive, complex legal permutations. In this state, Bradley explained, his tone completely clinical, a corrupt or lazy judge could grant an emergency temporary conservatorship based solely on a sworn physician's statement, especially if the petitioner claims the elderly subject is an immediate danger to themselves. He could freeze your bank accounts, change the locks on your guest house, and forcefully relocate you to a locked psychiatric ward for a mandatory evaluation. Bradley leaned forward, looking me directly in the eyes. "We are no longer dealing with a greedy, localized family dispute, Rick. We are operating inside a highly coordinated, aggressive legal ambush." Bradley immediately picked up his desk phone and dialed his senior paralegal. He wanted to know exactly which corrupt, bottom-feeding Dr. Mitchell had paid off to secure the fake diagnosis. As we waited in tense silence, Bradley pulled up my master estate file on his massive monitors. I told Bradley that Mitchell had always deeply hated, living in a massive house he did not legally own. Bradley began running a real-time, deep-level audit on the property's title history, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. The massive corner office was completely silent except for the rapid, aggressive clicking of the keys. Suddenly, Bradley stopped typing. He slowly turned the massive monitor around so I could see the screen. He pointed to a newly registered, highly encumbered lien recorded against the main property just 3 weeks ago. Mitchell had not just been stealing my monthly pension checks. The legal battlefield had just expanded exponentially, and the sheer, breathtaking scale of their betrayal was finally coming into the harsh light of day. I looked at the massive dollar amount displayed in bold black text on the glowing screen. Our race against time had officially begun. I stared at the glowing computer screen on Bradley's mahogany desk. The dirt, the wood, the concrete foundation, and the roof belonged entirely to me. Now, my ruthless attorney was showing me a digital county record, indicating that a massive, national financial institution had a legal claim to the property. "Open the specific legal filing, Bradley," I ordered. "I need to see the exact structural weakness Mitchell secretly introduced into my foundation." Bradley did not hesitate or offer empty words of comfort. It was the sickening realization that a catastrophic collapse was no longer a distant possibility, but a guaranteed mathematical certainty. Finally, the digital document rendered on the screen. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on the edge of the desk. The document was an official home equity line of credit, a HELOC. I looked at the principal amount approved by the bank's underwriter. The number was $300,000. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. Mitchell had secretly borrowed a massive, life-altering fortune against the very walls I had purchased to keep his wife safe. Bradley slowly scrolled down through the dozens of pages of standard banking clauses, exorbitant interest rates, and strict legal terms. Mitchell had essentially strapped a ticking financial time bomb to my daughter's living room. I looked at Bradley and stated a simple, indisputable fact. I am the sole legal owner listed on the property deed. How could a federally regulated bank legally approve a cash loan of that incredible magnitude without my physical presence in their office, my fingerprint, or my verbal consent? Bradley did not answer my question immediately. It was the primary signature page. There were 3 distinct black lines printed at the bottom of the paper. The third line was specifically designated for the guarantor and legal property owner. That line was meant for me. I looked closely at the digital ink on the screen. My full legal name was written directly on that line. Richard Alexander Dawson. I felt a sudden massive rush of pure absolute clarity wash over my mind. That is not my handwriting, I stated coldly. As a career structural engineer, I spent decades drafting incredibly precise blueprints by hand, long before computer-aided design software took over the industry. My lowercase letters are completely uniform in height and spacing, exactly like drafted text. The signature displayed on the monitor was a sloppy, arrogant, rushed imitation. The pressure of the pen strokes was highly inconsistent, indicating that the person writing it was frequently pausing to look at a reference document. It was Mitchell. He had forged my signature to steal $300,000 of my hard-earned equity. I pointed to the glowing screen and told Bradley exactly what I saw. I broke down the physical mechanics of the obvious forgery with the exact same cold, analytical detachment I would use to explain a failed concrete pour to a construction crew. Bradley nodded slowly, his face completely devoid of surprise. He leaned back in his tall leather chair and steepled his fingers together. Executing this level of financial fraud requires a highly coordinated and deliberate effort. Rick, Bradley explained. Mitchell did not just sit at a kitchen table and forge your signature on a whim. He had to falsify your personal income statements, and most importantly, he had to find a highly corrupt or criminally negligent notary public to legally stamp the document. Bradley pointed to the blurry blue notary seal stamped directly next to my forged name. He looked me in the eye, the gravity of the situation fully settling into the room. This single piece of paper escalates the situation from a minor family dispute over a stolen pension into federal bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. Bradley stated clearly, "These are severe felonies. They carry mandatory federal prison sentences." The scattered, chaotic pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together in my mind with terrifying precision. I finally understood the fake dementia diagnosis and the immediate threat of involuntary conservatorship. Mitchell was not trying to steal my future monthly pension checks. He had already stolen $300,000, and the money was completely gone. I explained my theory to Bradley. The entire criminal scheme would be instantly exposed. The only way Mitchell could prevent me from discovering the massive property lien was to have a judge declare me legally incompetent. If he successfully became my court-appointed conservator, he would intercept all my incoming mail, control my bank accounts, and have the legal authority to quietly sell the house to cover his tracks, all while I rotted away in a locked psychiatric ward, completely neutralized. The most devastating realization of the afternoon was not the stolen money or the forged signature. It was Sarah. I sat back in the heavy chair and looked out the massive window of Bradley's office at the gray, sprawling city skyline. Or was she simply a willing, greedy participant in the smaller plan to steal my pension money so she could keep buying diamond bracelets? I realized in that quiet office that the answer did not matter anymore. She had treated the father who gave her absolutely everything like a disposable inconvenience. The lingering emotional attachment I had to the idea of my family completely evaporated in that room, leaving behind nothing but cold, hardened resolve. I turned my attention back to my attorney. "I do not want to merely stop the conservatorship petition, Bradley," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want to completely dismantle their comfortable lives. I want every single illegal action exposed to the absolute harshest light of the law." Bradley smiled for the first time since I walked into his office. It was a cold, sharp smile that promised absolute, catastrophic ruin for my enemies. "In order to destroy them, Rick, we have to ensure your mental competency is completely unquestionable," Bradley said. "The forged signature is a powerful weapon, but if Mitchell manages to get a corrupt judge to sign the emergency conservatorship order tomorrow morning, all your assets, including your ability to pay me, will be frozen instantly. What is our immediate next move?" I asked. He looked at the heavy clock on his office wall. It was 3 p.m. "You are going to undergo the most rigorous psychological and cognitive evaluation available in the state," he ordered. "You are going to secure certified legal proof of your perfect mental health before the sun comes up tomorrow. Bradley made a single phone call to a private expedited medical clinic authorized by the state Supreme Court. At 6 a.m. the next morning, I was sitting in the sterile, brightly lit waiting room of the Cognitive Evaluation Center. I was not going to let a greedy son-in-law steal my dignity based on a lie. A young nurse called my name and led me down a long white hallway into a windowless examination room. Their sole job was to determine if an elderly citizen was mentally fit to manage their own life, or if they needed to be stripped of their basic human rights and handed over to a legal guardian. The lead doctor was a stern-looking woman with a thick metal clipboard. She warned me that the testing was explicitly designed to induce severe mental fatigue and frustration in order to break down any hidden cognitive walls. I looked at her and smiled. I spent 40 years calculating wind shear resistance on steel suspension bridges while dealing with screaming city contractors and delayed material shipments. I told her, mental fatigue is simply my Tuesday afternoon. Let's begin. She did not smile back. She started a heavy silver stopwatch on the desk, and the absolute interrogation began. They started with basic memory recall. They handed me a thick packet of complex geometric shapes printed on paper and asked me to mentally rotate them and identify the correct corresponding shadow from a list of incredibly similar options. It was a complete insult to a man who used to draft three-dimensional load-bearing schematics by hand before computer software even existed. His eyes widened slightly as he realized I had not made a single mistake. Then came the mathematical logic portion. I rattled off the numbers with the precise, rhythmic cadence of a metronome, staring directly at the blank wall behind them. The third hour was entirely psychological and conversational. She asked if I was hearing voices or seeing things that were not actually there. I leaned forward in my chair. I gave them exact dates, exact dollar amounts, and the specific name of the corrupt notary public my attorney had identified during our real-time audit. I am not paranoid, doctor, and I am certainly not confused, I told them. I am simply the primary victim of highly documented financial fraud. My attorney, Bradley Evans, will be subpoenaing this very medical record to use in a federal bank fraud trial against my own family. The room grew incredibly quiet. The doctors stopped writing on their clipboards and stared at me. The fourth and final hour arrived. Then, just to make my point absolutely clear, I recited them in reverse alphabetical order without skipping a single beat. The stopwatch clicked off. The three doctors gathered their papers and left the room to deliberate in private. I sat alone in the quiet white room for 20 agonizing minutes. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly what my mind was capable of achieving. The door finally opened, and the lead doctor walked back in. It was the official medical affidavit. "Mr. Dawson," she said, looking me in the eyes, "you scored in the 99th percentile for cognitive function. I am formally declaring that you are completely, entirely, and legally competent to manage your own affairs, your own finances, and your estate." She signed her name at the bottom of the document in thick black ink. The lead doctor stamped the paper with the official, raised seal of the state medical board, making it an undeniable legal fact. She handed the document to me. "I wish you the absolute best of luck in putting your son-in-law exactly where he belongs." I walked out of the medical center at 10 a.m. If he walked into a county courthouse to file his fake dementia claim, he would be instantly arrested for perjury and filing false legal documents. I reached my car and unlocked the door. I was ready to move from defense to offense and finally trap Mitchell in his own web of arrogance and lies. As my fingers brushed against my cell phone, the screen lit up with a sudden, sharp vibration. It was a priority notification email from my personal banking application. I frowned, staring at the glowing screen. Because my name was forged as the primary guarantor on the account, the bank's automated system had pulled my contact information from my credit file and sent me a standard courtesy notification regarding a massive outbound transaction. I stared at the screen and felt the blood freeze in my veins. The notification was a digital wire transfer receipt. He was attempting to move the entire $300, 1,000 in one single, sweeping motion. I looked at the destination details printed on the digital receipt. The routing number was attached to a private offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. Mitchell was not just stealing my equity, He was laundering it out of the country entirely. My engineering mind immediately calculated the catastrophic implications of this move. They would foreclose on the property and auction off my daughter's house to recoup their losses. Mitchell was preparing to take the money and vanish, leaving me entirely destroyed and Sarah completely homeless. He had likely realized his conservatorship plan might face legal resistance from me and decided to execute a scorched earth exit strategy. I did not panic. Panic is a useless, wasteful emotion that leads directly to structural failure. I immediately dialed Bradley's direct cell phone number. I read him the exact details of the wire transfer alert, including the transaction identification number and the offshore routing code. Bradley let out a sharp breath. The relaxed confidence from yesterday was entirely gone from his voice. International wire transfers of that magnitude are subject to a mandatory federal security hold, Bradley said rapidly, but that hold only lasts for a maximum of 2 hours. We have exactly 1 hour and 50 minutes to physically stop the transaction. Bradley gave me a direct, uncompromising order. A low-level telephone representative would not have the authority to halt an offshore transfer, and they would waste precious time verifying my identity while the clock ticked down to 0. Drive immediately to the regional corporate headquarters of the bank, located in the center of the financial district, Bradley ordered. I am drafting an emergency federal fraud injunction right now. If we do not reach the regional wire manager before the security hold expires, your 15 years of hard-earned equity will be gone forever. I threw my car into gear and sped out of the medical center parking lot. Every single minute that passed brought Mitchell closer to absolute victory. I thought about the sheer blinding arrogance of the man. He believed my age made me slow, oblivious, and easily defeated. I pressed my foot down heavily on the accelerator, weaving my classic car through the narrow gaps in the heavy traffic. I was not going to let a spoiled, arrogant thief steal the foundation I had built for my family. I arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that housed the bank's regional headquarters with exactly 1 hour left on the security hold. I sprinted through the revolving glass doors into the massive, echoing marble lobby. Bradley was already standing near the security desk, holding a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He handed me a copy of the emergency injunction and pointed toward the row of private executive elevators. We did not have an appointment. We only had the certified medical affidavit proving my competence and the undeniable proof of Mitchell's federal bank fraud. We walked right past the protesting security guards, stepped into the elevator, and hit the button for the executive floor. He had no idea that the man he thought he had broken was currently riding an elevator straight into the heart of the banking system, carrying the legal fire required to burn his entire offshore empire to the ground. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the absolute pinnacle of corporate banking. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany and lined with expensive modern art. We stepped out of the elevator and were immediately intercepted by a woman in a sharp gray suit. She informed us that the executive floor was strictly by appointment only and asked security to escort us back to the lobby. Bradley did not even break his stride. He demanded to be directed to the regional director of wire operations immediately. The woman attempted to physically block his path, but Bradley simply stated his name and the name of his high-powered law firm. He informed her that if she delayed us for even a single minute, she would be personally named as a co-conspirator in a federal bank fraud lawsuit involving the theft of $300. The woman froze, her eyes widening, and silently pointed toward a large set of frosted glass doors at the end of the long hallway. We pushed through the glass doors without knocking. The regional director was a middle-aged man sitting behind a massive glass desk. He stood up, his face flushing with immediate anger, demanding to know who we were and how we had bypassed building security. Bradley walked directly to the glass desk and slammed the emergency federal fraud injunction down onto the smooth surface. The heavy sound echoed loudly in the quiet executive office. Bradley leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "Sit down and look at the screen on your computer," he ordered the director. He recited the exact account number and the transaction identification code for the Cayman Islands wire transfer. The director hesitated, but the sheer, aggressive authority radiating from my attorney forced him back into his leather chair. His eyes widened as the massive outbound transfer populated on his screen. The director tried to deploy standard banking protocol. He claimed the bank could not simply halt a massive international wire without a verified court order or a direct request from the client who initiated the transaction. Bradley smiled his cold, devastating smile. It was a high-resolution photograph of the forged signature on the original home equity loan document, placed directly next to a certified copy of my actual legal signature. The man who authorized that wire is not the legal property owner, Bradley told the director, his tone slicing through the corporate excuses. Your bank negligently approved a $300,000 credit line based on an incredibly sloppy forgery. Bradley then dropped the final piece of paper. It was the certified medical affidavit from the State Supreme Court Medical Board, proving my absolute mental competency. Bradley did not wait for the director to process the overwhelming information. We had exactly 14 minutes remaining before the federal security hold expired and the money vanished offshore. We are completely bypassing the local banking chain of command, Bradley told the director. He placed the phone on the glass desk and activated the speaker function. A stern voice answered immediately, identifying himself as a senior agent with the Federal Wire Fraud Division. Bradley formally introduced me, and then instructed the bank director to identify himself to the federal agent. The director was sweating profusely now. He stated his name and his corporate title, his voice trembling slightly. The federal agent informed the director that he was looking at the real-time routing data for the Cayman Islands transfer. The agent ordered the director to manually override the local system and execute a hard freeze on the entire account hierarchy immediately. The director tried to argue. He warned that the bank would suffer a massive loss if the collateral was tied up in a federal court battle. I finally spoke up. I leaned over the desk, planting my hands firmly on the glass, looking the panicked executive dead in the eyes. You are no longer worried about a financial loss, I told him, my voice low and lethal. You are currently harboring stolen funds. If you let that money leave the United States, I will not just sue this bank for the lost equity. I promise you, I will tear your entire career down to the studs. The director swallowed hard. He looked at the clock. We had exactly 7 minutes left. He turned back to his computer keyboard. He reached the final execution screen. He pressed the enter key with a heavy sigh of defeat. The glowing monitor on his desk instantly refreshed. The status of the $300,000 wire transfer changed from pending security clearance to a bright red, flashing notification that read, "Automation federally reject, the funds had bounced." The absolute finality of that red flashing text was the most beautiful thing I had seen in years. The money was completely locked. Mitchell was officially trapped in a financial cage of his own making. Bradley thanked the federal agent and ended the call. He looked at the sweating bank director. I advise you to retain independent legal counsel, Bradley told him simply. Federal investigators will be arriving at your branch very soon to review your negligent underwriting practices. We walked out of the executive office and took the elevator back down to the lobby. The entire operation had taken less than 20 minutes. I walked out of the glass building and stepped back into the bright afternoon sunlight. I had blocked the catastrophic structural failure, but the engineering mindset requires you to anticipate the immediate consequence of applying massive counterpressure. He was going to realize that his perfect criminal plan had just spectacularly collapsed. I knew exactly what a man like Mitchell would do when backed into a corner. Desperation breeds extreme recklessness. I looked at Bradley and told him our defensive maneuvers were complete. He was going to come for the last valuable thing I possessed. I got into my car and drove away from the bank, knowing the real war was just about to begin. I parked my car at a small diner on the edge of town and ordered a black coffee. He needed liquid cash immediately to keep up the grand illusion of his wealth and to satisfy the creditors who were undoubtedly breathing down his neck. I sat in that quiet diner for exactly 3 hours, allowing the terrifying reality of his total financial ruin to completely shatter his arrogant mind. When the late afternoon sun began to dip below the distant tree line, I finally paid my bill and drove back to my property. I parked my daily driver on the street instead of turning into the long driveway. As I approached the guest house, I saw the immediate physical evidence of his violent desperation. The heavy wooden side door of my home was splintered and hanging open on a single broken metal hinge. He had used pure brute force to violate the only sanctuary I had left in the world. I stepped over the shattered wood and entered my home. He was looking for valuable jewelry, bearer bonds, or a forgotten safety deposit box key. He fundamentally misunderstood who I was and how I operated. I was an engineer. I trusted secure bank vaults and encrypted digital ledgers, not floorboards and mattresses. But as I carefully walked into my small bedroom, my blood turned completely cold. The thick metal of the box was twisted and bent out of shape, the locking mechanism completely shattered. I slowly fell to my knees and looked inside the empty dark space. He had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found the original leather key fob and the vintage paper title to the pristine 1968 Ford Mustang, parked in the detached rear garage. That car was not merely a piece of classic machinery. I had kept it covered and meticulously protected, refusing to sell it, even when Sarah begged me for the money years ago. Mitchell knew exactly what that classic car meant to me. But he also knew that a fully restored 1968 Mustang in that immaculate condition could easily fetch over $80,000 in pure, untraceable cash from a shady underground vehicle collector within a matter of hours. I stood up from the bedroom floor, my knees aching slightly, and walked out the back door toward the detached garage. A single dark patch of old motor oil stained the floor where the beautiful machine had rested safely for years. Mitchell had actually done it. He had stolen the one thing in the world I truly loved. Most men would have fallen to the concrete floor and wept over the profound violation. I simply stood in the empty garage, breathing in the faint lingering smell of old motor oil and exhaust, feeling the cold wind whip through the empty space. Mitchell thought he had dealt me a devastating emotional blow. He believed my old age made me an easy, vulnerable target for his cruelty. He did not realize that a man who spends his entire life building indestructible bridges never leaves his most valuable asset unprotected. He had just handed me the exact tool I needed to ensure he would never sleep in a comfortable bed again. I walked calmly back into my ruined guest house, pulling my cell phone from my pocket, and prepared to unleash the absolute wrath of the law upon him. What Mitchell failed to understand is that a structural engineer never leaves a critical load-bearing asset without a redundant safety mechanism. He was looking at the metal door, the way a starving man looks at a locked pantry. I knew instantly that if his financial house of cards ever collapsed, he would try to liquidate my vintage car to save himself. A visible defense only forces an enemy to plan a more aggressive attack. Instead, I drove the vintage vehicle to a highly specialized automotive security firm downtown. I had the technicians link the encrypted signal directly to a private application on my secure tablet. I built a digital cage around my own property, and Mitchell had just voluntarily locked himself inside of it. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out my smartphone. I dialed the direct emergency dispatch line for the State Highway Patrol. The phone rang exactly twice before a female dispatcher answered the call. I spoke with the precise, measured cadence of a man reading a technical manual. I informed the dispatcher that I needed to report an active Grand Theft Auto in progress. I provided the exact license plate number, the vehicle identification number, and the specific paint color code. The dispatcher began to run through her standard script. I told her I knew exactly who took it, and I knew exactly where the vehicle was currently located. I walked over to my overturned kitchen table, righted a single wooden chair, and sat down. A bright red, pulsating dot was moving rapidly down the southbound lane of the interstate highway. I read the live coordinates directly to the police dispatcher. I gave her the exact mile marker and the estimated rate of speed based on the real-time satellite telemetry. The dispatcher paused her typing, clearly shocked by the absolute precision of the data I was providing. I informed her that the man driving the car was my son-in-law, and that he was currently attempting to flee the jurisdiction with stolen property valued at over $80, $0. The dispatcher placed me on a brief hold while she relayed the exact coordinates to the active highway patrol units in the sector. He was actually driving himself deeper into a federal penitentiary. The dispatcher came back on the line. She asked me to remain on the line to confirm the identity of the driver once the physical apprehension was complete. I agreed and placed the phone on speaker, resting it on my leg. He probably believed he had finally beaten me. Suddenly, the red dot on my digital map stopped moving. It completely halted directly in the center of the interstate highway. A few seconds later, the dispatcher's voice echoed through the speaker of my phone. I recited Mitchell's exact height, weight, hair color, and the expensive designer suit he was likely wearing. The dispatcher verified the information with the officers on the scene. I thanked her for her precise efficiency and ended the call. The room went entirely silent again. His entire life was shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. But the chain of consequences was not yet complete. Sarah was still sitting comfortably in the massive house I had paid for, entirely unaware that her husband had just been arrested for grand theft auto and that the federal government had frozen all of their fraudulent assets. It was time to deliver the final devastating blow. My cell phone vibrated heavily against my leg. He intended to trade my priceless vehicle for pennies on the dollar to secure immediate, untraceable escape funds. But Mitchell was an arrogant corporate coward, not a professional getaway driver. The officers responded by planting a heavy knee firmly into his spine and securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. Mitchell was currently sitting in a cold concrete holding cell at the county jail, facing multiple severe felony charges, including grand theft auto, fleeing and eluding law enforcement, and violently resisting arrest. Less than 10 minutes after I hung up with the detective, I heard the frantic, chaotic sound of high heels clicking rapidly against the concrete walkway outside. The broken front door was suddenly pushed all the way open, hitting the interior wall with a loud thud. Sarah stood in the doorway. She was frantically clutching her cell phone to her chest. She took one trembling step into the ruined living room and saw the overturned furniture, the shattered wood, and the scattered debris. It was the loud, ugly wailing of a woman who had just watched her entire privileged existence evaporate into thin air. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes and told me Mitchell had just called her from the county jail using his single, allotted phone call. She choked on her own tears as she explained that the local magistrate had denied him immediate bail because he was considered a severe flight risk. Sarah crawled across the messy floor toward my wooden chair, reaching out with shaking hands to grab the fabric of my pant leg. She swore they would completely abandon the fake conservatorship petition. Every single word falling out of her mouth was entirely focused on her own comfort, her own social standing, and her own financial security. She did not offer a single genuine apology for the forged medical documents, the stolen pension money, or the profound disrespect they had shown me for the last 3 years. I looked down at my daughter crying on the floor. I sat perfectly still in my chair and let her tears fall onto my leather shoes. "Let go of my clothes immediately," I commanded. My voice was completely flat and utterly devoid of any paternal warmth. Sarah flinched violently at the absolute coldness in my tone and slowly pulled her hands back. I told her that her husband had violently broken into my private sanctuary and stolen an $80,000 liquid asset to fund his escape from federal justice. I watched a sudden wave of deep confusion wash over her tear-stained face. He had not told her about the frozen bank accounts or the failed offshore wire transfer. I leaned forward in my chair and looked directly into Sarah's terrified eyes. I dropped the heavy stack of legal documents directly onto the floor in front of her. "Your husband is not just a car thief," I informed her. "He secretly forged my signature to take out a $300,000 fraudulent loan against the very house you are currently living in." I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror as she stared at the highlighted bank statements. I told her that federal investigators were currently auditing every single transaction Mitchell had ever made, and that all of their shared bank accounts were permanently frozen by the United States government. "Mitchell is not coming home tomorrow, Sarah," I stated. "He is going to federal prison for a very long time. Suggest you get off my floor and go back to your massive house to pack your designer bags, because very soon you are not going to have a roof over your head." Sarah stared at the heavy stack of legal documents resting on the torn carpet of my ruined living room. It was the certified forensic audit of the $300,000 home equity line of credit. I watched her perfectly manicured nails scrape against the paper as her eyes darted back and forth across the dense financial text. It was the address of the massive property she had lived in for the past 15 years. While you were busy planning to lock me away in a state-run psychiatric ward, I told her, my voice cold and steady, your husband was busy mortgaging the very ground you walked on. She shook her head violently side to side, attempting to physically reject the reality printed in black ink. I asked her if the forged signature looked like my rigid, drafted handwriting. The color completely drained from Sarah's face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. I continued laying out the exact dimensions of the trap her husband had built for them, detailing the failed Cayman Islands wire transfer and the permanently frozen mutual funds she thought secured her wealthy lifestyle. I watched the exact moment her mind comprehended the absolute totality of her ruin. Her survival instinct kicked in, and it was entirely focused on preserving herself at any cost. She fell back onto her knees and grabbed my hands. She promised she would testify against Mitchell in federal court as long as I protected her from going to prison and allowed her to stay in the main house. I looked down at the woman who shared my DNA and felt a profound, sickening disappointment. I walked back and held the cheap aluminum can directly in front of her face. Did Mitchell also force you to feed me garbage while my pension deposited $500 into your account every single month? I asked her. Did he brainwash you into standing in my kitchen yesterday, eagerly nodding along while he threatened to lock me in a heavily medicated nursing facility? Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. True victims do not wear expensive diamond tennis bracelets purchased with stolen health insurance funds, I told her. You are not a victim of Mitchell's greed. You loved the lavish lifestyle far more than you ever loved me. I told her I would not be calling Bradley Evans to help her with a divorce. I told her that when the federal agents arrived to question her, she would have to face them entirely on her own. She slowly stood up from the floor, wiping the smeared makeup from her eyes. She thought the main house was still her ultimate sanctuary. She had absolutely no idea that the ground she was walking on no longer belonged to her. Sarah reached the broken doorframe and placed her hand on the splintered wood. She let out a long, trembling breath, believing the absolute worst of her nightmare was finally over. Sarah, I spoke into the cold evening air. She stopped and looked back at me over her trembling shoulder. When I bought that house 15 years ago, I didn't buy it for the interior decorating. I am a structural engineer. You and Mitchell have spent the last 15 years living inside a house that is sitting on land, legally zoned for heavy commercial use. I watched her eyes blink rapidly as her exhausted mind struggled to process the information. I had protected her sanctuary out of pure, blind paternal love. Yesterday morning, before Mitchell kicked open my front door, I said, I drove directly to the downtown corporate offices of the largest commercial retail developer in the state. I sold the entire 2-acre parcel of dirt right out from under your feet. Sarah's jaw dropped open, a sickening choking sound escaped her throat. She tried to find a logical flaw. She stammered that I couldn't possibly sell the house because Mitchell had just placed a $300,000 bank lien against the title. I smiled a cold, devastating smile. A retail conglomerate building a $50 million commercial center employs an army of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the country. When their legal team discovered the active bank lien, they used my certified medical affidavit and the obvious forensic proof of Mitchell's forgery to legally nullify the bank's claim to the physical property. The land was transferred entirely free and clear. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy wool coat one final time and pulled out a single crisp piece of white paper. I read the heavy black text aloud. It was a mandatory 30-day notice to vacate the premises. The retail developer is not interested in becoming a residential landlord, I informed her. You have exactly 30 days to pack whatever worthless items you can carry. They are going to completely level the entire property and pave a commercial parking lot directly over the exact spot where your bedroom currently sits. The sound that erupted from Sarah's throat was not a standard human cry. The woman who had treated me like a disposable nuisance was now kneeling in the dirt with absolutely $0 to her name, facing imminent homelessness and absolute public ruin. I stepped carefully around her trembling body, walked out the broken front door, and stepped into the cool evening air, leaving her entirely alone in the darkness. The heavy mahogany doors of the county courthouse felt like the gates to an inevitable mathematical conclusion. Mitchell was brought in, wearing a violently bright orange county jail jumpsuit, bound by thick steel chains around his waist and ankles. When the judge asked him how he wished to plead, Mitchell completely unhinged. He dramatically begged the judge to grant him an emergency psychiatric hold on me, claiming he possessed a sworn medical affidavit, proving my advanced dementia. Bradley Evans stood up and walked into the central well of the courtroom. He stated clearly for the official court record that I had scored in the 99th percentile for cognitive function. Mitchell's pale face turned the color of wet ash as the judge broke the seal and reviewed the undeniable proof of my sanity. He detailed the entire structural reality of Mitchell's criminal enterprise to the court. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, revoking Mitchell's bail entirely, declaring him an extreme danger to the community and a catastrophic flight risk. He was going to spend the next several years in a tiny concrete cage. On the morning of the 31st day, I parked my car across the street from the massive suburban estate. The wealthy neighbors she used to host for lavish dinner parties stood on their porches watching her public humiliation. When the 1-hour deadline expired, the heavy yellow excavators rolled up the driveway. The fortress she had used to justify her arrogance was violently reduced to a pile of worthless rubble in less than 20 minutes. 2 hours later, she called me from a borrowed cell phone, begging for a meeting. She begged me to lend her just $3,000 to secure a basic lease on a small one-bedroom apartment, promising to find a job and pay me back. I looked at my daughter. I slid it across the sticky table until it touched her trembling fingertips. "This is exactly the amount of money you deemed sufficient for my weekly survival," I told her. "I am simply matching your standard of care." I stood up, told her the gravy train had permanently derailed, and walked out, leaving her staring at the $20 bill that represented the absolute totality of her remaining wealth. The federal sentencing took place 3 months later. He would never work in the financial sector again. Sarah was currently residing in a small, dimly lit room at a cheap highway motel on the far industrial edge of the county line, working the late evening shift at a local discount retail store for minimum wage. I returned to my property one final time. I packed my best clothes, my passport, and the original leather key fob to my late wife's pristine vintage muscle car, which was resting safely in a high-security, climate-controlled storage facility. I purchased a first-class one-way ticket to Rome. When we landed in Italy, I moved into a beautiful, secluded stone villa nestled high in the rolling green hills of the Tuscan countryside, purchased by my wealth management firm. As I sat on my wide stone terrace, sipping a glass of vintage red wine and listening to the rhythmic chirping of the night crickets, I realized my foundation was finally entirely my own, and it had never been stronger. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that shared blood does not automatically grant someone the right to your endless sacrifice. The most profound act of self-preservation is having the absolute courage to walk away and let them burn in the fires of their own making. If you believe that respect must be earned, and that toxic family members should face the absolute consequences of their actions, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story in the comments below.